Hello, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Jewel Ratzlaff, and I'm the coordinator for the Poughkeepsie Public Library District of the NEA Big Read. Our literature this year is the memoir, Hope Jaren's memoir, called Lab Girl. If you haven't had a chance to read it, I would definitely encourage you to take a look at this marvelous writer. She's also a scientist. The book itself alternates in chapters between the story of her life and her experience becoming well-known in her field, as well as these other chapters that focus on botany. They're fascinating. Great reading. Today, our program is focused on restoring local landscapes. We're going to be hearing from Dr. Meg Ronsheim of Vassar College. Meg studied at Earlham College, got her PhD at Duke University. She's been at Vassar since 1992. Dr. Ronsheim's current research focuses on the impact and management of invasive vines, forest regeneration, and restoration ecology. Her invasive vine research focuses on two species, the porcelain berry and the oriental bittersweet, and includes experimental work both in the field and in the greenhouse. She and her colleagues have also examined the potential impact of the emerald ash borer on the forested areas of the Vassar Farm and Ecological Preserve. Since 2010, Dr. Ronsheim has worked with her students to restore the Edith Roberts Ecological Laboratory, one of the earliest ecological restoration projects in the entire country. Dr. Edith Roberts was a professor of botany at Vassar College from 1919 to 1949. She co-authored an early and influential book on landscaping with native plants. It was called American Plants for American Gardens. She also established an ecological laboratory on the Vassar College campus, creating examples of all the major plant associations found in Dutchess County at the time. Today's presentation starts by looking at Dr. Edith Roberts' work in Dutchess County. Dr. Meg Ronsheim.
Leading ecologist in the country. He was one of the founders of the field of ecology and a very important founder in the Ecological Society of America group too. And he was famous for taking his field trip courses. And so I actually just recently saw a photograph that Edith Roberts had taken of him on one of these field trip courses. So she was at least on one of these trips where they would go off and explore everything from local areas around Chicago all the way all over the country, really. And so Edith was trained by him in this sort of cutting edge area of plant ecology, where they were learning about the different plant associations of the country. And what she did then is, after she got her PhD, she got a job at Mount Holyoke, and she continued that work looking at the distribution of beach plants, tree communities in the Holyoke Range, and really taking this idea of plant associations. It was a new idea in the field of ecology at the time, and sort of thinking about how plant distributions are linked to the environmental conditions of that particular location. So whether it's water availability, it might be how cold it gets at night, whatever it might be, these sorts of things then influence the particular kinds of plants that are growing in that area. And so then when she came to Vassar, she was going to be teaching this material to her students, and she went out in the county, and there really were not very many native plant communities remaining. And so, she was an ecologist, a plant scientist. And so to teach then, she decided to create this ecological laboratory as essentially it's an outdoor teaching lab for her botany classes. And so they could go out and they could learn about the local plant associations right here on campus. It was also a location where they could study plant taxonomy, physiology, and do all sorts of other research and experiments on the plants. And so her vision for this ecological laboratory was to establish the plants native to Dutchess County in their correct plant associations with the appropriate environmental factors in each association. And so what they did then was used a process called constructive conservation, where they went and collected seeds or plants that were going to be demolished in the course of developing a site. And so collecting them thoughtfully, bringing them back, actually then figuring out how to germinate those seeds, and then growing them up and then planting them out at this site. And it wasn't just about the students that she was thinking about. She was also interested in creating an attractive landscape so that local community members could come and visit the ecological laboratory. So it was meant to be something that was available to the general public. And as was mentioned at the outset, this was really recognized as one of the first restoration projects in the country. And so when she arrived, she made a request to the Board of Trustees to have 4 acres of land. It was described as being 4 acres of poison ivy with a few oak trees. And the next year, they began to prepare the site for planting. So designed the topography, figured out drainage, created a lake pond area, plowed it to remove some of the weeds. I'm sure poison ivy was at the head of the list, planted cover crops, installed water lines and things, and sort of really beginning to get the site ready. They also then went out and did a floristic survey of the county to determine what species composition there was in all the different native plant communities and the sorts of environmental conditions that they were growing under. Again, I mentioned they collected seeds, and then they had to experimentally determine how to actually germinate these seeds. So, you know, seeds of different species have very specific germination requirements, and these were unknown. And so Edith and her students really made a huge contribution in helping us learn how to actually grow these native plants. So in 1923, the planting really began in earnest. And I love this quote. She said, "It will be at least 10 years before this laboratory garden will at all interest the person untrained in this field, but a more rapid execution of the plans would entirely destroy its function as an educational asset to the department." So she really saw it as a teaching laboratory. And the students worked with her to create a map of the different plant communities that would go in different regions. And I'll talk about those later. But there was a pine association, a gray birch association, a beech maple hemlock association, oak hickory, streamside, pond, bog, ravine, juniper. So a lot of different areas represented here. And this is just a photograph showing the students working in the ecological laboratory in 1922. One region of the laboratory was set aside for experimental work. Other areas were really designated for primarily planting those native associations. And I just want to give you some examples of the species that they grew, both in the ecological laboratory and elsewhere on campus. I suspect they had plenty of plants growing from all the seeds they germinated. So a lot of those were used as landscaping plants on the campus. So this is some mountain laurel. This is flowering dogwood. So you can see the fruits on there. That's probably taken about, actually October 17th. So right around this time of year. This is some viburnum prunifolium, also in the ecological laboratory. And there are also some relatively rare species that they were able to get growing here. There was quite a large population of pink lady slipper orchids in the ecological laboratory. This is just to give you an idea of what the site looked like early on. So this is when they were first constructing a path. Off to the right there, you can actually see the Vassar Chapel. This is what the site looked like about 10 years later. This is a shot of Raymond Avenue as it looked like before it was redone. And you can see that's a picture of Vassar Lake. And so it was a much narrower road back in the day. And so along the edge there, they planted the Juniper Association. And this is what it looked like in 1932. You can see the trees are growing up nicely. And this is what it looked like in 1946. This is a picture of the Gray Birch Association shortly after it had been planted. This then grew quite well, and she actually created that stone wall using funds that she earned by giving lectures. And this is what it looked like in 1946. This picture actually inspired my students to plant some gray birch along a stone wall that still remains in the ecological laboratory. This is another photograph taken near the creek, the Fountainkill Creek. And that's what it looks like in 1946, probably about this time of year with spicebush and royal fern. And this is a shot of Skinner Hall of Music. And those white flowering trees off to the left there, those are flowering dogwoods. And Edith and her students were some of the first people to really figure out how to successfully and reliably germinate flowering dogwood seeds. So from this project, they were able to establish over 600 different species of flowering plants and 60 species of mosses in this ecological laboratory. They developed methods of propagating many different species of native plants. And if you're interested, I can actually point you to a reference that talks about some of those methods. There were a number of articles and so on published by both undergraduates and graduate students working with Edith, and alums in 25 different states were inspired to create native gardens, native plant gardens, to try and help conserve native species. It was recognized in Botanic Gardens of the World in 1939, and there are a lot of different articles and books that were published using data from this particular project. So this is just some. One of the first that came out was this one, the 1928 Native Plants of Dutchess County, and then she published an article in the Journal of Ecology, and then she actually co-authored a book with the Dutchess County historian on the role of plant life in the history of Dutchess County. But probably the most important publication to come from this was the book that she co-authored with Elsa Raymond, entitled American Plants for American Gardens. And in this, they really outlined how native species could be used in landscaping design. And this book has been really influential. It was actually reissued in 1996. And so just to give you a couple of examples of some landscapes that were inspired by this book, this is a landscape that was designed by Darrell Morrison. He's actually the person who made it possible for that book to be reissued in 1996. Really a gorgeous view there. A little closer to home, this is at Manitoga, which is Russell Wright's house right on the Hudson, just about an hour south of here. And he was really inspired by Edith's book and created a beautiful, beautiful landscape around his home. So Edith Roberts retired in 1948. She actually went to MIT and continued doing research for another 20 years. But so I'm not sure if that really quotes as a retirement. But a sewer line was put in 1957. And as you know, sewer lines are often put in along creeks because they have just the right slope for things to drain appropriately. And so that certainly altered things. Raven Avenue was altered in the late 1960s. That also changed water flow. And then in 1994, a boardwalk was created through the site, replacing the stones, the large stones that had been put there originally, and invasive species of shrubs were removed. During all of this, some of the associations were lost. So for the ravine and the juniper associations, those would have been lost when Raymond Avenue was widened. The bog and the pine associations did not persist. They weren't really successful, but a number of species disappeared, such as the lady slipper orchid, the pink azalea, the flowering dogwood, and other species arrived, such as Phragmites, honeysuckle bushes, porcelainberry vines, and more recently, the amber cork tree. And so what actually then remains of those native plant communities? And one of the reasons I find this to be a particularly interesting question is we can learn a lot from this very first restoration effort here. We can learn about, what kinds of methods are successful in creating communities that can persist for 100 years. So this ecological laboratory was maintained through the 1940s. There was some maintenance for another maybe 10 years or so, but really nothing much had been done with it for quite a number of decades. And so can we actually restore areas that don't need constant maintenance? What things actually were successful and able to persist? So some things disappeared, not because of issues of the plants not making it or anything. Back in 1929, Belle Skinner's brother decided to build a music building on Vassar campus in honor of her. And so you can see Skinner Hall was sort of put right down in the middle of the open field region. Again, Raymond Avenue widening, got rid of the juniper and ravine associations. A new path was put in that went through the Oak Hickory area. But again, the pine area really did not persist, nor did the bog. So This is just an overlay for those of you who might be familiar with Raymond Avenue. You can see that's here along this diagonal. Hopefully you can all see my cursor. And you can see there's a remnant of it here, and then another large chunk of it here still remaining. Then plans began to coalesce around the idea of putting in a bridge building to replace the mud chemistry building. And you can see this dotted orange shape here. This is now the Bridge for Laboratory Sciences, and that was put into one of the two remaining pieces of the Ecological Laboratory. And so that area is also now gone. So I've been working since 2010 in this area, trying to manage it and keep out most of the invasive vines. And so this is just to give you an idea of what actually has persisted since those plantings were done in the 1920s and early 30s. And this is a shot in early spring. Those big tall bushes are speckled alder, a native species that is actually great for nitrogen fixation. It's underneath in the understory there are skunk cabbage plants. And off in the distance here, you can just see sort of a red, some red stems there. That's red osier dogwood, another native species that has continued to do quite well at the site. These are some other spring ephemerals. So the skunk cabbage, when it comes up, it actually can melt through snow, attracting fungus gnats to pollinate its flowers. But other species like bloodroot, another spring ephemeral. So these are things that come up before the trees leaf out. Hepatica, trout lily, these are still at the site. Dutchman's breeches. Edith had a master's student who worked with Dutchman's breeches, and there's quite a large population, I think probably still from her experimental plots. We have Jack in the pulpit, wild geranium, marsh marigold has persisted at the site. So there are a lot of species still there. We also have some really beautiful shrubs, native shrubs that are still on the site. This is American bladdernut, and they form like sort of like balloon-like structures around the seeds. So there'd be seeds inside of those, which makes it very difficult for anything that wants to get at those seeds to successfully get through that sort of bladder-like covering. And we also have a spice bush, which is gorgeous right now, those beautiful yellow leaves. But it's also one of the earliest spring flowering shrubs. Also, that top right corner picture is an early spring flowering spice bush. Has beautiful red berries right now. And winterberry is another really beautiful plant that, again, persisted for over 120 years, or up to 120 years. Nannyberry, this is actually a species of viburnum, which also is still here. So what does this mean then in the broader scope of things? So she planted these things, her students were able to learn a lot. We gained a lot of knowledge about how we germinate and grow native species. But what about sort of broader impacts on other kinds of organisms? So we did a vegetation survey along the Fountainkill Creek back in 2012. And I just want to draw your attention to these sort of larger circles right here. Pink are non-native species. And in this, you can see sort of the impact of Edith Roberts' plantings. There were more native species there than a lot of other areas along the Fountainkill and also in other areas on campus. And so there was a persistent effect. And this area also had higher bird counts and greater species diversity of birds in this area along this corridor. So right in this region, this is where the Ecological Laboratory is. And the greener the dots, the more the species are like the kinds of birds that you find on the Ecological preserve. Sorry, misspeaking here. So there are birds that don't do so well in urban areas. The red and orange dots, those tend to be birds that do quite well in urban areas. And so we're seeing not only more birds, but also a different group of species that are then living in the area of the Ecological Laboratory. And so I've continued working on restoration of this area, and we've been removing invasives, we've been planting natives. I'll just give you some shots. So the vegetation survey was done before we did a lot of removal. And since that time, we've removed a lot of invasive honeysuckle, a lot of invasive multiflora rose. These are a couple of my students from one summer. They got really good at ripping things out. We had a great time. And we removed a lot of porcelain berry. The big shot in the background, that's a bunch of porcelain berry growing up on trees on campus. The little picture of berries on the left, you can see why people thought it was such a wonderful plant to have growing, because the berries are really beautiful. Unfortunately, porcelain berry vines really climb up trees and cover everything, and the trees underneath then don't have enough sunlight, and so they do die. And so we removed these invasive vines and then planted native species. And so just to show you some of the areas along the boardwalk now, this is cardinal flowers that we put in. We also put in Joe pieweed and boneset and a number of other flowering plants. So when we think about this, you know, why restore and why even plant native species? Why do we talk about invasives? And I should say that invasives does not necessarily mean that they are not from North America originally. Invasive refers to the behavior of the species. Invasive species are species that do not share. I was giving a tour to a group of kindergarteners, and their teacher was trying to explain invasive species, and I thought this was a brilliant way to talk about it, which is invasive species simply don't share sunlight or resources with other species. And so that means that you lose other species from the area, so it becomes less diverse. And so that has other kinds of implications. So again, why plant native species? Why are we even concerned about invasives or non-native species? And so there are a bunch of different reasons. One is that native species are beautiful. So we all love flowering dogwoods and redbuds and other sorts of things. But they also provide important ecosystem services for people. So this has been recognized for a very long time. So this is a quote talking about Bishop, who in 1750 made note that as areas were cleared of wood, brush, and so on, small streams began to dry up. And so there was a recognition that having plant cover and native plant species around watersheds was actually important, both for the persistence of those small creeks, but also in terms of water quality. And so this is something where we talk about buffer zones being a good thing to have along stream sides nowadays. We also know that trees provide a lot of ecosystem services. So for example, they can save homeowners money because they provide shade in the summer, which reduces the amount of air conditioning needed. It can also reduce heating bills in the winter because it can provide a windbreak. It's also very important for recharging underground water supplies because it slows runoff during storms. So it just doesn't run off into the Hudson River and then into the ocean. It actually slows down and percolates into the soil. It will actually follow those root traces down into the soil, which replenishes that groundwater. There's actually been quite a few studies showing that the presence of trees in urban areas reduces air pollution and can really help to improve public health. But why natives? Why not just trees? And this is actually foreshadowing the closing speaker for the Big Read here. I want to say that having Doug Tallamy come is going to be a wonderful opportunity to hear really an excellent speaker and also hear his ideas on restoration. So I encourage all of you to attend that. But this is actually some data that he got together looking at essentially caterpillar biomass on native species and non-native species. And if you look at that little box I've highlighted in red, you can see that with native species, there's nearly 400 insects versus 70 insects on non-native plants. So we often think about insects on plants as being bad, right? Because they're eating plants that we want to eat or we want to have look beautiful. But insects and caterpillars are actually really, really, really important to the whole ecosystem. And so many birds, like the Carolina chickadee, use caterpillars as baby food. So if you have a lot of caterpillars in an area, those chickadees have a lot of baby food to feed their baby birds. And so they did a study looking at number of trees and size of trees and so on and so on. And they found that with more trees, you got more chickadees successfully fledging from nests. And they did find that chickadee populations decline when there is a higher proportion of non-native trees, simply because there is less food available. And so they would actually find nests with baby birds in it that had died, and the parents were obviously trying to feed them because there'd be lots and lots of sunflower seeds in the nest, but the baby birds couldn't really eat those sunflower seeds, unfortunately. And so by planting non-native trees, we're essentially creating a food desert for other organisms that would be living in that area. We also know that with greater biodiversity, we have a reduced risk of disease for ourselves, so that areas with more animal species in the Hudson Valley region have a lower risk for Lyme disease. And so having biodiversity of plants, which then supports greater biodiversity of animals, can lower disease risk for us. Invasive species can by themselves also increase the risk of disease. So there have been studies done in Connecticut looking at the impact of Japanese barberry plants on prevalence of Lyme ticks. And they may be beautiful ornamentals, but unfortunately, they're excellent habitat for ticks. And so on the bottom right-hand corner, you see someone dragging a flannel, a meter square of flannel through the woods to sample for ticks. I actually really recommend that in your own yard if you want to get rid of your ticks. We do that. We go drag our yard with flannel and then put the ticks in masking tape and remove them so that we don't actually have to spray our yard. But what they do is they can sample, you can look and see, and areas with lots of barberry have many, many more ticks than areas without barberry. Native plant species also support native pollinators. And we've been hearing a lot about pollinators and honeybees and so on and so on. Honeybees are actually not native. They are brought over. And while they're important pollinators of many crops, there are many, many species that are not actually very effectively pollinated by honeybees. And so native pollinators are actually very important worldwide. And even when plants can be pollinated by honeybees, very often native pollinators do a better job, and so they actually will increase crop yields. So things like blueberries and tomatoes really rely on these native pollinators for really good seed set. And pollinators need sources of nectar all season long. And so this is an example of a nectar calendar that we created for the Ecological Preserve here at Vassar. And you can see that over time, so this is June through October, all these different species flower at different times. And so by making sure that you have plants that flower throughout the entire season, you can make sure that species like butterflies and moths, and also species like bees, have nectar and pollen available throughout the growing season. And by providing native species that can do this, you're really providing an important resource to sustain those populations. If you think about it, very often our crops only bloom for a few weeks, right? So there have to be other species around to keep those pollinators alive when our cherry trees or almond trees aren't actually flowering. So getting back to this somewhat historical perspective on the plant communities of Dutchess County and thinking about how they might have changed, I sort of want to reflect on that and then think about what kinds of current factors are impacting native plant communities. So one of the things that Edith Roberts did was, I mentioned the book that she co-authored with the Dutchess County historian called The Role of Plant Life in the History of Dutchess County. And in there, there's a lot of interesting information. There's actually a map showing all the big trees of the county, and it's pretty cool to see where they were. But she also took a 9-foot by 4-foot aerial photograph of the county and put on there where they found different kinds of tree species and where different plant associations were located in the county. And this allowed us to go back and create that map in the center, which is showing where gray birch was located. And we have an idea of where those sorts of communities were in the county at that time. We also, just as of last week, I was able to get from her ancestors, or I should not say ancestors, her descendants, not exactly, her nieces and nephews, there we go, a book that she used to document where they actually collected all the seeds and plants for the ecological laboratory in Dutchess County. And so that's another piece of information that we can use to try and understand what was growing in the county back 100 years ago and where it was growing in the county, to try and understand how things have changed over time. And we know that tree cover in general has changed in the county. So we can look at aerial photographs, which is another kind of information that really is an excellent supplement to the kind of information we have from Edith Roberts' work. So if we look at the 1936 aerial photograph and compare that to 2000, we know that there are more trees in Dutchess County by far. They've increased by 147% over that period of time. However, if we look at it in more detail, what you can see is on the left, the blocks of forest were relatively large if you compare to what they look like now. Now there's more tree cover, but it's very, very fragmented. There's a lot of edge, right? So a lot less interior space and a lot more edge space. Edges tend to be drier, sunnier. They may have more impact from wind, so that may cause more wind throw or just change what species are able to live there. There's some species that need those interior spaces to live because they can't tolerate those other environmental conditions. And so there are sort of globally recognized habitat fragmentation is seen as one of the primary threats to biodiversity. There's lots and lots of examples of how intact forested areas have been turned into essentially islands of forest in a sea of development and agriculture. And so when you have these islands, it becomes very difficult for animals and plants and other organisms to move from island to island because they're so isolated from each other. It's no longer a continuous habitat. And so roads and so on can really have a huge impact on a lot of different species. And so that's one of the ways that vegetation has changed. And we've had regrowth, but now we have more edge and very little inner spaces. We've also had a lot of forest regeneration that occurred with low deer densities. Deer are now overabundant in much of the Northeast. And actually, this is a global issue with ungulates because we removed their predators. So we don't have cougars and wolves here, but worldwide, predators have been really hit pretty hard. And so a lot of these herbivores no longer have any sort of population control from those herbivores. And this has a huge impact on current forest regeneration. So these are just two plots at Rockefeller, which is in Dutchess County. And you can see when a fence has been up for 20 years, there's a lot of young saplings coming into those areas. In areas that aren't fenced, they've been completely cleared of all seedlings and saplings. So there are no young trees to take the place of trees when they die. And so this is a concern. We're having a lot of issues with oak regeneration. Pennsylvania is having very little oak regeneration right now. And so this idea of, you know, where are the young trees going to come from? There are a lot of factors. We also think that there are other invasive species that have been causing some of these issues as well. But again, thinking about the importance of forest regeneration. And of course, this, I couldn't resist this. This is actually a picture on Vassar campus, and those are yews, and deer love yews. And I always joke, I'm about 5 feet tall. And so that's about how high deer can reach easily. So I'm about deer browse height. So if you ever drive around and look, you'll often see a line where all the trees are perfectly pruned at 5 feet. So I don't hit my head, but other people will. Other things that are happening. So if you're a gardener, you may have noticed that the plant hardiness zone maps have changed significantly. And that's because temperatures are changing. We're also seeing changes in rainfall patterns, and we're seeing species migrating into new locations. So in Black Rock Forest, there's now data showing that sugar maples are now in decline there. And so we're likely to see a lot of species, if they're able to migrate, migrating further north, and we may be getting other species that are typically from more southern regions are actually going to be moving into this area because the environment is changing. We also know that this changes when things happen, like when buds break I don't know if any of you are lilac enthusiasts, but for many decades, there's been careful track kept of when the first lilacs flower. If you and any of you are fungi enthusiasts, morels, there's also been very careful maps made each year of exactly when the first morels have been spotted at various locations. And that data collection really has led us to realize that things are changing in terms of when they happen. So Henry David Thoreau's journals have also been used to track phenology. And we know that now birds are arriving earlier, flowers are coming out earlier, leaves are leafing out earlier on trees. And so this is something that we're also seeing in terms of changes with local plant and animal communities. We also know, again, invasives are coming in, and yes, New York is very, very much a hot spot for this, and that's because there's a port there, and we have a lot of things coming in. But also, if you think about it, there are other ports in other parts of the country, but those regions may not be as hospitable for the species that are coming in. And so they often don't get established and so don't spread as much. But we have a great place for all these things to grow and thrive. And so we're really seeing a lot come in to this region in particular. I don't know if you've been hearing about the spotted lanternfly. It's quite something. Came into Bucks County, and it's in Philadelphia, and actually it's now about 50 miles away. And it eats everything from grapes and apples and cherries and oak trees and maples, and it does a lot of things. And they're about that big, so they're big. Anyway, I've been hearing stories about everybody going and crunching them underfoot just because they were so upset at what they were doing. So spotted lanternfly, keep your eye peeled for those. But so thinking about this, you know, when I work with my students, they're really interested in trying to understand what can we do here, right? So it's all well and good to sort of think about the history of a site and how things have changed and why they may be changing. But if you want to try and preserve biodiversity, what can we do to support local ecosystems? And there are lots and lots of things that we can do. One of these is to plant trees, native trees. So this is a project that we did on the Vassar Ecological Preserve back in 2013. We had over 200 volunteers planting over 1,000 trees. And I'm happy to say that those trees are thriving. They're doing very well. It's been really exciting to see that sort of regrow. And we intentionally chose species that do well with climate change, so species that are from slightly more southerly regions or are known to do well in warmer and potentially drier climates. We can also do things to reduce habitat fragmentation and repair those migration corridors. So this is another project that we've been working on at Vassar. So on the left, that's a aerial photograph of the Ecological Preserve. Up at the top here, this is Hooker Ave. Zach's Way is over here. This is Cedar Ave on this side. And then we've got Spackenkill Road down here. And there was an area right here that had been used as a composting area for a while. And this is over here, just a blow up of that area. And you can see there's this gap here in this, what is really a fairly nicely forested eastern corridor on that side of the preserve. And so I started working with my students about, 5-6 years ago, thinking about ways that we could actually restore that former composting area. And it's in a really, really important migratory corridor. We have coyotes that actually have a den on the southern end of the Ecological Preserve, and they move up through the Ecological Preserve and then out through the golf course. So about 2-3 in the morning, they're actually in a fairly green space further north. But they really move through that very narrow corridor there to get into these other habitats. And so it's not just coyotes, it's lots of other animals use that as a very important migration corridor. And so to repair that, we first off had to say, yeah, this is a pretty bad spot, and talk with folks on campus and get the political will to move forward and do something about this. And I'm happy to say that last summer, we were able to get it regraded. We seeded it with native grass seed, and we had a group of students working with us throughout this process. And then this past spring, We planted. It was originally going to be a group of students in the spring semester, but of course the COVID really put a damper on that. But we were able to get the trees, and we were able to plant as family units, socially distanced and masked, and got 200 trees in. And just last month, we put in another 500 trees. And this time we were very happy to be having students involved in planting trees. They thought it was really a lot of fun, and also really a very positive thing to be doing outside, socially distanced, and putting in trees. And we've actually seen now that bobcat are beginning to use that area that we're restoring. I don't know if you can see its little eyes peeking out over the vegetation there. So we can also work to manage invasive species, things like emerald ash borer, invasive vines, and soon the spotted lanternfly. So the emerald ash borer, you may have heard of this. It was brought into Michigan in the early 2000s, and it only eats ash. Unfortunately, it girdles the trees and kills the ash. In Michigan, they've had 100% mortality pretty much in most regions, so it's really of concern. So one of the things that we did was, before it got to the ecological preserve, we saved seed and put it in long-term cryogenic storage. And we've been protecting 12 mature ash trees so that we keep them alive, to keep them going in terms of being able to produce seed and so on. And we also have been working with the USDA. They've been releasing biocontrol agents to try and save the ash trees. About 10% of the trees on the ecological preserve are ash. We also partnered with the city of Poughkeepsie to create a map of all the street trees, showing which of the ash trees in the city were already infested and which ones were still healthy, to help them plan for removal of dead and dying trees, and also to help them plan and prepare for replacing those species, or that species, with other trees to maintain the urban tree canopy. We also working on managing vines. So porcelain berry is my personal, I don't know, I'm very impressed by that plant. It's a really impressive plant. It takes a lot of work to get out, but I have been working on it for a while to try and keep it off the trees. But Oriental bittersweet is another really important invasive vine. And we know that when trees get up in vines, not only do they kill the trees eventually, but also they catch the snow. And then when we get ice storms and windstorms and so on, this tends to break branches and bring trees down. And this then creates light gaps in that canopy, which allows other vines to grow. And it's sort of like expanding holes of Swiss cheese in the forest canopy. And so we've been working to try and think about what we could do in some of these gaps. And we have a lot of ash, and sort of thinking, with the death of the ash tree, we don't want Oriental bittersweet and porcelain berry to completely dominate things. Those are two of my students. They're not in the tropics. That's on the drumlin on the ecological preserve in one of the vine gaps. And so we identified a number of gaps, and we're trying to see if American chestnut can actually be a way to mitigate some of these, putting them in, getting shade, and allowing them to outcompete some of these vines. So managing invasive species, but also then planting, not just trees, but also pollinator gardens. And so I already mentioned pollinators are important. And so by creating gardens and nesting sites, we can really help to support these native pollinators. And so this is an example of a rainbow pollinator garden that we created at the Wimpheimer Nursery School here on campus. And each of the different classes had a different flower color, and they're in blocks so they can learn their colors. They can learn about seeds, how to grow plants, learn about flowers, pollinators, and also have a great time digging in the dirt. We also have been working with the folks at College Hill Park. They have a beautiful pollinator garden there as well. And Peach Hill is another wonderful place for pollinators. And I know there's a lot of interest in sort of creating these stepping stones for pollinators through urban areas to maintain that connectivity and maintain those populations. You can also create some amazing nesting areas. So they need more than just nectar and pollen, right? They need host plant species for caterpillars, but also nesting sites. So I think my level of expertise would be the one on the left, but some people have gotten incredibly creative and designed things that will support a whole range of different species, depending on the materials, the size of the holes, and so on. Different species of native pollinators will use those. So very quickly, I want to sort of finish up by thinking about other things that we can do to try and reconnect people with the landscape and have them think about what we're doing, and maybe think about how we value certain kinds of areas, maybe in different ways. You may have been hearing this idea of natural climate solutions for climate change, planting trees. There's just an article that came out talking about converting 30% of agricultural land in Europe back to natural ecosystems as a way to sequester carbon. There's a lot of interest in sort of this restoration right now. There's another study done that estimated that all the greenhouse gases produced by car and truck traffic in the US could be mitigated by simply planting trees, and in areas like, abandoned fields or lots or along roadways and unused spaces. Also changing some of our agricultural and forestry practices to sequester more carbon in the soil. So restoration actually could be a really powerful tool in really shifting that dynamic with CO2 concentrations right now. And so, but people have to be able to see that there's a possibility of that, and they also have to see what's around them to see how things are changing and understand that. So one of the things is that we can use these pollinator gardens in natural areas to really counteract what's been called the extinction of experience. People are not going outside as much, although maybe COVID's changing that. Again, we're finding the value of outside spaces. But in general, people are spending less time outside, going to natural areas less. And we know that being outside has positive effects for mental health, physical health, and so on. And so, very often, people go outside and they just see green. And so we aren't really, as a society, able to identify the plants that are even growing outside our doors. Around here, it's really handy to be able to identify ticks, right? Another skill that you can get by going out and looking at things like weevils and beetles and knowing that they're not ticks. But we haven't lost our ability to identify things. We all know all the logos and what flavor of cereal this is or whatever. So we're very able to still identify things. It's just that we're not identifying things that are out in nature. And it's not just the loss of experience, it's also the fact that our baselines are shifting, right? So sometimes this has been called generational amnesia, where, we know that after a few years, it doesn't feel like it's any warmer than it used to be, or, you sort of lose track. Well, it's always looked this way. But in fact, it hasn't. Things have been changing. And this is an area on campus near the Shakespeare Garden a few years ago, but that's what it looked like in the 1950s. Without that photograph, I would never have known, right? But when the alumni come back, they know that that landscape has changed because they remember what it used to look like. Here's another area on campus. That's what it used to look like. Another area on campus by Ely there, that's what it used to look like, right? So we have to recognize that landscapes have been changing over time, and that we're not outside and seeing those landscapes as much either. And so by spending time outside, learning about local plants and animals, providing opportunities for people to be outside, creating urban green spaces and gardens, and then improving existing green spaces, these can all be positive things that we can do. So I just want to end by saying restoration was really important at the very beginning here with Edith Roberts, and we're still doing it now, although in a different context and with different motivating forces probably, but still there is that connection. And I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you. Oh, that's terrific. So Tracy has a question. Lots of housing development going on now. Are these developers required to plant natives?
No, they're not. It was relatively recently, within the past 5 to 10 years, that New York required that nurseries label species that might become invasive. And so you can actually see things are labeled that way now. But just a few years ago, I was over at a gardening center across the river, and there was Oriental bittersweet being sold because, of course, people love its berries. So a lot of these things that we know are problematic, are still being sold. And
Mhm.
also, once you've got the plants out there, they're producing seed anyway, and so it's hard to sort of do anything about that. So there's no requirement for planting natives. Great idea, though.
Wouldn't it be? Who else has a question? I don't see anything else in chat. So if you do have questions and want to unmute, we can take some more. Kara?
Oh, yeah, this was fabulous. Thank you so much. I wonder if you can get the American Plants for American Gardens book now. Is it in print?
As far as I know, yes. So it was reprinted in 1996, but I think it's still available. And it really is, it's amazing. It's got some great pictures of Dutchess County too. A very famous photographer, Margaret Brown. I didn't know she was famous until I looked into this, but anyway, evidently she's quite a well-known photographer, and so it's really beautiful. And I would also say that once COVID is over, if you're ever interested, I'm always more than happy to give tours of the Ecological Laboratory. And we had really hoped to be able to do that. But obviously, right now, Vassar is closed to the outside community. And so we couldn't do that this time. But I actually am more than happy to do that. I also have frequently taught people how to pull out porcelain berry. So I've gotten very good at that as well. So
that sounds like a great program for sometime down the road.
Well, I tell you, I don't know if you've ever tried to take a kid's arms out of their sleeves when they don't want to take their arms out. Okay. So that's what it reminds me like, because these porcelain berry has sort of thick roots that kind of branch out horizontally and they tend to be in kind of wet areas. So it really feels like you're trying to get a small child's arm out of a jacket. Anyway, it's very satisfying when you get it out though.
Who else has a question? Do you ever use volunteers for planting in open areas?
You know, we haven't on campus that much. So you know, we have a wonderful grounds crew. And so I'm sort of working in the Edith Roberts area, but they're sort of in charge of the rest of the campus landscape. But on the other hand, there are often volunteer days at College Hill Park. And I know that Friends of Peach Hill, there are a lot of actually Vassar folks, and I'm a member myself, Friends of Peach Hill. They also do a lot of restoration work there. And we're actually interested in seeing if we could get an American chestnut orchard going there. And so that would be another possible project. So
great comment. This was wonderful. Oh, lost it now here. This was wonderful. Thank you. Looking forward to a tour when COVID is in the past. All right. Yes, Beth.
Cool. Oh, yes. A wonderful presentation, and of course, loved the photos and the before and the after, and those were amazing. Would you have a list, or would we just Google pollinator flowers that we could plant in our community?
That's a great question. So, there are actually a number of really good websites. The person I would actually have you contact about that is Jen Rubo.
Okay.
Jen Rubo, she runs the environmental cooperative here at Vassar. And she's been doing a lot of work with pollinator gardens in the city of Poughkeepsie and also on the Ecological Preserve. And she coordinates a lot of volunteer events. And she works a lot on the fall kill and things like that too. And she would be the one to really, I mean, I could send you a couple, but I think she's got a lot more than I do.
Okay.
So,
Great. Thank you.
yeah.
I can give you her email, Beth.
Oh, okay. Thanks.
Yes, Barbara, did you have a question?
Yes. Yes, Meg, thank you for showing the picture of the College Hill pollinator garden, because I've been working on that I'm a landscape architect. I've been working on that for over 5 years with Jen, and she's amazing. So anybody who wants to experience pulling out invasive plants, they had taken over the whole area, and it took years and years to remove them. But it's just a persistent problem that I think everybody who's interested in restoration has to put that maintenance into the equation. You can't plant natives and walk away because the invasives are here. And that's been my experience. But I really enjoyed your presentation very much.
Well, in college, that's beautiful there. So thank you for your work on that, because it really is gorgeous. And I agree, it is maintenance. In my experience, I mean, some of the areas that we worked in were just solid porcelainberry. And it was just like, at first it was like, okay, we're doing this like small area because that's all we can do this summer, right? And then each summer we worked on a different area. And so we worked through area by area. And now, you know, it is maintenance, but we're getting them when they're small. And so I'm completely obsessive about pulling them out when they're small, because within 3 years, they're awful. So if you keep at it, but you know, I really feel like there's been this sort of shift with vines. And they were around before, but now they're just so much more dominant than they ever were. Have you noticed in trees this fall, they're like, if you look at a number of them, you'll see like the red Virginia creeper leaves all the way up the trunk. And Virginia creeper is a beautiful native, but it used to be much more on the ground and lower. And I don't ever really remember seeing sort of trunks just covered all the way up. And grapes, I mean, our native grapes are getting much more dominant and covering things as well. So I feel like there's just a general shift too. And, you know, interestingly, you know, vines tend to grow in warmer areas. So most of the vine research has been done in the tropics and so on. And so, I mean, I'm very interested to hear from other people about their experience with vines, simply because this seems to me to be a relatively new shift.
Lynn, did you have a question?
I have a question, yes. So I've been walking at the Vassar farm, I call it the Vassar farm, for 45 years. And it's changed quite a bit down now. You know, it used to be a little stream, and now there's a whole area of wetlands with the beaver pond. And I'm wondering if all that is good. Is that helpful to the environment, or?
So the beaver ponds would have been there before. So we exterminated the beaver, and they've come back. And I know that they can be problematic if it's flooding someone's home, right? But we're lucky enough that it actually, you know, it wasn't flooding anything like that. And what we've seen is lots of native wetland plants come back.
Okay.
And yeah. And so we're starting to see really, you know, it's not invasives. It's actually dominated by a lot of natives. And we're seeing a lot of birds using it. So that's actually seemed to have been a very good thing for biodiversity. And it also slows the water down. And that helps in terms of cleaning that water. And of course, we all drink Hudson Valley water, you know, out of the river, right? And so that goes into the river. So we're actually, I think, cleaning. We have seen that the insect fauna in the streams is better. And so I think that it is a positive thing. Yeah. We just have to control the vines on the edges of the forest, right? And fill the gaps, right? Yeah.
I have another question, but I don't want to dominate things. I don't know. I've worked on the Fallkill Creek to clean up the Fallkill Creek during certain times of the year. And there was some planning around improving the Fallkill Creek and improving access. Do you know if that's moved along?
Well, I know that still is in the plans. I think things have slowed down again with COVID and so on. But I know that, you know, they've been doing the bio blitzes and things like that. And so they're definitely planning on continuing. It's just a matter of, I think, waiting another season to be able to go back and do some of those things.
Okay.
But yeah.
More good news. More good news. Thank you.
Yeah.
Beth?
Yep. One more question. When you pull these vines out, how do you then get rid of them? What do you do after you pull them out?
So
You can't burn them.
Yeah, I roll them up, and because especially if they have seed, I roll them up and stick them in a bag and send them off to the incinerator. The problem is they root like crazy if they're on the ground. So I have cut some and, you know, left them pretty high up, and then, you know, snow, rain, whatever, they'll come down. If they touch the ground again, they root. And I'm like, I got rid of it. And then I pull it out and it's like this long and it's just, and so you really have to get them out. And unfortunately, the porcelain berry really reroots very well. Bittersweet doesn't. So you can cut bittersweet and that will actually kill the vine, but then it will resprout from the roots. But they tend to be smaller when it resprouts. But you got to get, yeah, persistence.
Okay. Thank you.
Anyone else? Yes, Kara?
Well, I was just going to say, as far as native plants, there's a National Wildlife Federation site. If you go to them.org, they have a native plant finder. So you can just put in your zip code and find the native plants in your specific region.
Thank you. There was also a question, Meg, about can you actually burn these invasives?
Well, there are issues with burn permits. You don't want the things to get out of control. And so I don't burn. And on campus, I don't have a pesticide applicator's license or anything like that. And so we just rip them out and bag them and get rid of them. I know that some people have actually tried burning Oriental bittersweet. It comes back worse. So I would not recommend that. And also, I think, you know, with a lot of poison ivy coming in, you can get the ivy in the smoke. And I know you can get inhalation poison ivy, which is not good. So I would be very cautious about that. There are some regions where fire, we know that Mohonk, there are fires regularly, right? This is a fire adapted landscape at some level, but we're also in a very urbanized area. So I'd be cautious.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up. And again, I will send the recording out once it's ready. I'll send it to you and you can share it with other folks, because I think it was a wonderful presentation, and I do want to spread the word about the great work that's being done. And I thank you, Meg, for taking the time to tell us all about it. And we do look forward to a tour sometime in the future. That'd be great.
Yeah, and I'm always happy to answer questions. So don't hesitate if you do have thoughts or anything to reach out. So thank you for all coming. I'm amazed it's a gorgeous day out there. So thank you for coming inside and listening to me. And yeah.
Thank you for doing it. We appreciate it.
Thank you for great questions too.
All right. Take care.
Yeah,
Bye.
bye-bye.